first WOW Talk of 2022, academic year 2022-2023. Today we have three special treats. So we'll start with a presentation by Dr. Alexa Alice Joubin, and she's a professor with the English department and is affiliated faculty with the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program here at GW. She's also the co-founder of both the GW Digital Humanities Institute and the MIT Global Shakespeare Performance Archive. These performances helped expand the exploration of performative arts from around the world, and she's co-general editor of the Shakespearean International Yearbook and has guest edited special issues of the journals Shakespeare, Journal of the British Shakespeare Association, the Asian Theatre Journal, and Borrowers and Lenders, the Journal of Shakespeare and Appropriation. Through her outreach, she's testified before Congress concerning the humanities and has been interviewed by journals such as Foreign Policy, Oxford University Press, and Fogger Shakespeare Library. Dr. Joubin, thank you for joining us. Please share your slides.
It is my pleasure to speak to you about transgender studies and why it matters. Gender has emerged as the latest wedge issue. Vladimir Putin used scaremongering about gender and sexual orientation to support his authoritarian agenda. In the midst of Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin took time to complain about cancel culture in the West, claiming that Western elites had canceled novelist J.K. Rowling because she did not please fans of so-called gender freedoms. Putin is referring to Rowling's attacks of transgender rights. It is, of course, odd that Putin should take time to support Rowling. In fact, if we look closely, Putin's and Rowling's obsession about gender purity is not odd at all. And this obsession about gender purity is very much related to racism. Right-wing politicians follow the same playbook. The pandemic of COVID has fueled intersectional forms of hatred and fear that have now coalesced under gender. Gender is merely the latest scapegoat. There is a long history of associating trans bodies with illness and the inversion of trans individuals' personal truths. Anti-feminist, white nationalist, misogynist, anti-immigrant, and homophobic movements have used the notion of genderism to evoke a range of disruptive identities and to attack human rights. The inequities exposed by the pandemic can spur change for the better, and this is why trans studies matter today. Transgender theory can help us deconstruct toxic notions of racial and gender purity, and also help us understand a wider range of human variance. Even before the recent global crisis, gender has always structured our society and cultural activities, influencing how we read history's relevance to our times and how we read forward to shape contemporary performance practices. And as you can see, I'm listing some of the problem here is the last bullet point, especially. Transgender studies challenges the ways in which we produce knowledge. Historically, knowledge about human experiences, about gender, has been produced to cater to the dominant groups, and therefore we only have knowledge that is complicit in the oppression of minorities. And the lesson from trans studies can be applied to critical race studies, for example. The word transgender emerged in 1987 when Leslie Feinberg used the term to refer to people who challenge the boundaries of sex and gender. Susan Stryker used the term to refer to those who do not conform to prevailing expectations about gender. And some medievalists have used the term now to look at individuals who are beyond gender without categorizable gender, connecting transness to ideas of transcendence. Now, cisgender assumptions expect that those who are assigned male at birth always grow up to be men, and those who are assigned female always grow up to be women. These assumptions deny the fact that life is an unpredictable and unscripted journey. These assumptions shape the questions we ask and organize social activities. I propose trans as method. So gender is a social practice. Gender is not a an identity category. Gender is in fact a set of evolving interpersonal relations and social practices that evolve in the presence of other people and in time. If you think about our own practices of gender in terms of grooming habits, our preferred sartorial choices, it very much depends on context. One would present themselves differently on a date versus going to a gym or something very informal, right? So gender really isn't a category. It's simply how we practice it on a day-to-day basis. Trans theory puts into focus and expands our collective understanding of human variations. So trans as method enables us to analyze the what, the how, and the why of gender practices. It deconstructs the toxic formulation of the who of identity categories that raise questions about unspoken assumptions about categorical membership in the sense of to which public restroom one would belong. The examples I cited in the beginning about Putin and Rowling may suggest that right-wing ideologies are afraid of trans individuals. In fact, it is not fear, it is hatred. Those people who support patriarchal institutions tend to police gender expressions, particularly femininity. Trans activist Julia Serrano has written a lot about trans people. Serrano calls the phenomenon scapegoating of femininity. The patriarchy focuses its energy on guarding the superiority of masculinity. So trans feminine identities, trans feminine practices by trans women devalues cis heterosexual masculinity by rejecting it. So the presence of trans individuals here, they are a threat because they pose a category crisis. They challenge putative binary distinctiveness of gender. It poses what is known in social identity theory as distinctiveness threat. When a group sees the boundaries defining their identity as indispensable, they feel threatened when these definitional boundaries are blurred. And so I wanted to propose that we can look at gender not just as social practices, but also through a perspectival tool. This is a theory borrowed from art history. One of the most well-known perspectival tool is anamorphosis. This is a technique in visual arts that produces a distorted image when seen from the usual viewpoint, such as standing right in front of the painting. When viewed from a particular angle, however, the distortion disappears. Renowned examples of anamorphosis include those from Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks and The Ambassadors by Hans Holbein the Younger in 1533, such as this painting in front of you. Right in the front, you see some distorted sketches. That's actually a skull, right? It's a memento mori, reminder that death is always around the corner. And anamorphic images remind us that we can unlearn our habits of perception and learn to look differently. Just because something doesn't quite fit the current knowledge system doesn't mean that it is wrong. In fact, it is our limited knowledge system that needs updating. Commenting on The Ambassadors, psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan characterizes the gallery viewer's belated revelation as truth that surfaces in a liminal moment. The anamorphic skull emerges when, having passed in front of the painting, the viewer turns around to look at it from the door, from a new angle. So in this economy of gaze, what we see reflects how we see. The anamorphic images of transness as grotesque is therefore the product of a particular and fixed vantage point. Here is another 21st century American example. This is a self-portrait by the artist Paul Richmond. And he titled it The Piece That Doesn't Fit. You can see on the upper left, in the upper left corner, we have normal kids happily playing. Richmond drew them as two-dimensional stick figures, and they're on a solid blue background. That blue background is broken up into perfectly aligning puzzle pieces. Now, Richmond himself is situated in the piece that doesn't fit. The artist's self-portrait isolated against the black negative space is on the puzzle piece that does not fit the allotted space. What's so interesting, however, of course, the others are all two-dimensional, but Richmond himself is actually three-dimensional, even if he is not smiling, unfortunately. But who is to say which one is more normal when the others are actually two-dimensional stick figures? This is such a powerful painting. When I saw it, I felt that portrays so many important ideas of trans and queer studies. Now, the piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit, is it the three-dimensional pieces problem? Or would you rather say perhaps it is the allotted space that's problematic and needs to be fixed? So I have been working on the theory called a trans lens, using a different lens to look at literature, to look at film. And we can apply trans as method as well to cultural and performance studies to look at narratives that have overlooked trans aesthetics. In literature, characters with atypical experience of gender are often misunderstood because people have a tendency to map what they already know onto what seems uncategorizable. And so if you look at screen culture, trans people and characters are often accused of fabricating an identity to deceive those around them for sinister purposes. There's the famous murderer in the 1980 movie Dressed to Kill. Now, if these characters deviate from binary expectations, they are disavowed as a pretender, such as the titular Albert Nobbs, the award-winning film from 2011, or Susanna in the French movie Nos années folles from 2017. Now, if the characters present as heterosexual, as cisgender men or women, they risk forced disclosure, as is the case of Brandon Tina in the movie Boys Don't Cry, or Dorothy Michaels in the 1982 movie Tootsie. Performer and activist Julia Serrano observes that the media often presents trans women as either cunning sexual predators or laughable fakes. This pattern of representation, in fact, harms cisgender women as well as trans women and trans men, because it leads to the tendency to regard femininity as artificial. So this is actually a form of sexism, a form of traditional sexism in which masculinity is deemed superior by default. Accusations of fake identities are a tactic of social control. Gender nonconformity only comes to be associated with fraud through demands of disclosure and through claims that certain bodies or identities do not match as they ought to. And so my solution, of course, was the trans lens that I mentioned before, how you look at the painting, the angle you choose to look at it, and also to regard transgender and gender practice categories as social practices, to look at the how and the why rather than the who belongs where. And I want to conclude by applying very briefly trans as method to my field of study, Shakespeare studies. We know that Shakespeare's plays often feature cross-gender roles, and professional performances in Shakespeare's times, they feature only male actors. Boy actors performed female roles on stage. much ink has been spilled over the theatrical gender of the boy actors and the female actors, but the field so far has regarded the boy actors as transvestite actors who engage in the cisgender practices of, quote, cross-dressing. Scholars have pit the stage body of a boy actor against the imagined body of a woman. They overlook that some of these boy actors, they were actually queer. And even after they grew up, they carried what we call a trans residue. They continue to play non-binary roles, and even in their off-stage life. So we can ask interesting new questions now that we have the trans lens as a tool. How might the stories change if we consider them as transgender performance rather than a cisgender-centric cross-dressing stories requiring suspension of disbelief? Instead of asking, why did the English stage take boys for women? We should perhaps think about the cisgender formulation of that question itself. What if the body of the female character and the actor's presence exist on a continuum rather than in contradiction? When the enactment of gender practices is not always predicated upon substitution, such as substituting the boy actor for Desdemona or Ophelia, or diagnostic recognition, such as being reminded of the, quote, real body beneath the illusion of Desdemona or Ophelia. Many plays lend themselves to transgender interpretations. Twelfth Night is energized by Cesareo's presence. We have a young woman named Viola washed ashore in Illyria, and Viola decides to present as Cesareo, a page boy, to seek employment. And from that moment on, we don't have Viola anymore. We only interact in the story with Cesareo. And even in the final scene, Cesareo alludes to Viola's maiden's weeds, saying that they would change back into their old clothes. That never happens. He never changes into them. And his lover, Duke Orsino, continues to call him boy and by the name Cesareo. So this kind of fluid language cast Cesareo as both a man and the Duke's fancy queen in a future that is never solidified, but heavily alluded to. So this kind of story, traditionally read as a cross-dressing story, and in the end, everybody goes back to their old habits, can now be reread with this trans lens, and we'll get so much out of stories like this. And here's my web link and my email address. Thank you.
Any questions for Professor Joubin? So this is absolutely fascinating, and I've read some of the work on it. How does it accord with the work of trans activists and people that would say it's their personal identity rather than a performance? Has there been kind of discussion, or is there stress between these two kind of ideas of like gender is what you perform and other people's gender is this is my identity, it's who I am?
Thank you so much, Evie. Excellent question. Performance is quite powerful. It can peel back the layer and allow us to think about artificiality of any kind of social practices. Performance is empowering for a trans activist to own their practices, both on stage and off, or on screen and off screen. But at the same time, it's a double-edged sword, because detractors often accuse trans people for performing, as if performance is always inauthentic. So it's a place where we tread very lightly. When we apply performance studies methods to trans studies, we always have to apply it with a caveat and make sure that people don't misunderstand. We are talking about trans practices as merely performance, right? Performance as in something that is elusive, perhaps, or even to mislead people. So double-edged sword, I would say. But definitely there are more and more activists and actors who are queer. They are taking up space, they're owning performance and use that to try to.
Adrienne, you have a question?
Hi, yes, thanks. I'm Adrienne Hancock from Speech Language Hearing Sciences, and I actually study voice and communication in trans populations, and I have had some discussions about whether things like voice training or surgeries that help people present, or you might say perform, in a way that our culture accepts as feminine, actually might be reinforcing this need for, or kind of making them conform to performance and actually concealing their trans identity, which contributes to minority stress. So could you speak to the idea of, I mean, very bluntly, does helping someone change their voice to sound more feminine, is that actually harmful and somehow communicating that they're not feminine enough just as they are? Or is that helping them to perform a feminine role that they want to perform?
Thank you so much, Adrienne. And I've been admiring your work and your very important program at GW. In our literature program over the years, I've had students from the speech and voice therapy as well. I believe very firmly in affirmative treatment. The voice training is as important as surgery and any medical intervention any individual would choose to go through. Each person has different needs. And I believe in the very important recognition of the very wide range of practices and identities. Some people are binary, and I believe we should celebrate that. Some people are non-binary, they are fluid. And for those who happen to be binary, I don't think life is livable or that they can survive without going what has sometimes been called stealth. It's very important for that group of people. And therefore, what you offer in the clinic is life-saving. So there's no question about this kind of treatment is conforming to the binary ideals. I think that is that kind of accusation would be quite inconsiderate, would be quite narrow in the imagination, and in fact denying the variety of gender practices when some people do need that. Why is it the burden of the minorities not only to educate the society, but also to be forced to be the poster boy or poster girl, to be the one who's different the entire time and to bear the scar and the burden, right? Some people are totally fine with that. They would be openly trans, openly queer. Others, it's a different case. And so over time in my interviews so my field is performance studies, I work with actors. And in my interviews, they've told me this very, very wide range of experiences. And what is so important, I believe, in trans studies is to recognize and celebrate that, rather than having a very fixated, narrow idea of trans. When people think of trans, I think they have very narrow imagination of particular kind of experience, perhaps those who are more vocal, and so we hear more about, and we assume that's the stereotypical, classical, standard trans experience, but there are many others, there are many kinds. And so I would never say this treatment is reinforcing any kind of problematic binaries. Why are specific groups not entitled to that, right?
Thank you both very much. This is a really valuable and interesting discussion, and I hate to cut it short, but we have two other fantastic speakers to get to. I really encourage you though to connect after the WOW talks. That's part of the purpose of the talks, is to bring together people.